It had started innocently enough. I hadn't thought anything of it when Emma, my wife's sister, began staying with us. She was going through a rough time. Her recent breakup had left her emotionally drained, and she needed a place to clear her head. My wife, Claire, had always been close with her sister, so it made sense that Emma would come stay with us for a while. It was just temporary, I reminded myself. It was the least we could do. At first, things were normal. We went about our daily routines. Emma spent most of her time in her room or out with Claire, and I kept to myself, focusing on work. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. Subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it was there. A glance held a little too long, a brush of the hand that lingered. It was small, so small that I convinced myself I was imagining things. One evening, Claire had gone out with friends, leaving me alone with Emma. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, when she came down the stairs, freshly showered, dressed in a loose-fitting robe. Her hair was damp, her skin glowing from the heat of the shower. She looked different, softer, more vulnerable than usual. I tried not to stare, tried to keep my focus on the screen in front of me, but it was hard to ignore the subtle tension that seemed to settle between us. "Is Claire still out?" she asked, her voice casual as she walked over to the couch. "Yeah," I nodded, glancing up at her briefly. "She won't be back for a few hours." Emma sat down next to me, the faint scent of her soap filling the space between us. We chatted for a while, small talk, mostly, but there was an underlying tension to our conversation, an unspoken weight that neither of us addressed. It was in the way her eyes lingered on mine, the way her knee brushed against my leg when she shifted on the couch. "I feel like I've been a burden," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. I frowned, turning to face her. "You haven't been a burden, Emma. Your family. It's fine." She smiled softly, but there was something behind it, something vulnerable, almost fragile. I don't know what I'd do without you two." I didn't know how to respond. The room felt warmer, the air thickening with something unspoken. Emma's gaze lingered on mine, and I realized then that her knee hadn't moved away. In fact, it was pressed lightly against my leg, and neither of us seemed to acknowledge it. "I don't know what I would have done without your support," she continued, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Her words hung in the air, and I felt a shift between us. Something I couldn't explain but was undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, we sat there in silence, the closeness between us heavy with meaning. And then, before I could stop myself, I glanced down at her hand resting on her lap, noticing the way her fingers trembled slightly. "I'm glad we could be here for you," I said finally, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Emma looked down at her hands, her lips pressing together as if she was fighting some internal battle. When she looked back up at me, there was something new in her eyes, a flicker of something that made my heart skip a beat. "Can I ask you something?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Of course," I replied, though a strange feeling had settled in my stomach. She hesitated for a moment, then bit her lip, glancing away briefly before looking back at me. Do you think I'm attractive?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't expecting it, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had heard her correctly. My mind raced, trying to find the right words, but all I could do was stare at her, dumbfounded. "What?" I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. Emma shifted slightly, her gaze never leaving mine. I've been feeling so lost lately. I don't know who I am anymore, and I needed to know." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong. Claire was my wife. Emma was her sister. But the way she was looking at me, the vulnerability in her eyes, it was hard to ignore. Harder still was the growing tension between us, the heat that seemed to radiate from her skin. Emma, I started, but she cut me off. You don't have to answer, she said quickly, shaking her head. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. She moved to stand, but before she could, I reached out, my hand gently grabbing her wrist. She froze, her eyes widening as she looked down at where our skin touched. I should have let go. I should have stopped this before it went any further. But instead, I held on. Emma, I said softly, my voice barely audible. You're beautiful. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us was deafening, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest. I knew we were crossing a line, but I couldn't stop it. Neither could she. Emma's eyes stayed locked on mine, wide and filled with something I couldn't quite define. Vulnerability, confusion, and something else that was harder to place. I let go of her wrist, but she didn't move away. Instead, she just stood there, frozen in place, as if waiting for something to happen, for me to make the next move. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing in my ears. This was wrong, I kept telling myself. It was beyond inappropriate. But the tension between us had already shifted. There was no pretending anymore. The soft touches, the glances, the conversations that seemed innocent on the surface, but were laced with something deeper. It had all led to this moment. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the calm front she was trying to keep. I don't know what's going on with me. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. Emma, this is complicated. She nodded, biting her lip as she looked away. I know. For a moment, I thought maybe that would be it. Maybe she'd walk away and we'd both pretend like this conversation never happened. But instead, she took a small step closer, her body brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, making my heart pound even harder. Her eyes met mine again, and I could see the internal struggle reflected in them, desire battling against guilt, longing clashing with the awareness of what this would mean. We should stop this, I said, my voice hoarse. I know, she whispered again, but she didn't step back. Instead, her hand lifted slowly, hesitantly, until her fingers brushed against my chest. The touch was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a wave of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. I grabbed her wrist again, but this time it wasn't to pull her away. I held her hand there, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push her away and end this before it went any further, but my body refused to listen. The air between us was charged, thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we had been denying for weeks. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Neither of us moved. We stood there, inches apart, her hand resting against my chest, my fingers gripping her wrist gently, and in that moment, it felt like we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something that couldn't be undone once we stepped over that line. Emma, I began, but my voice caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix this, but she didn't wait for me to finish. Instead, she leaned in slowly, her breath warm against my neck. Her lips hovered just inches from my skin, and I could feel the tension building, the pull between us growing stronger with every passing second. We can't, I whispered, but even as I said the words, I knew they didn't hold any real conviction. The truth was, I didn't want to stop, and neither did she. Her lips brushed softly against my neck, barely a kiss, more like a gentle caress. The touch sent shivers down my spine, and I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, trying to remind myself that this was wrong. But the more I tried to pull away, the more I found myself drawn to her. She pulled back slightly, just enough to meet my eyes, her face inches from mine, I could see the same conflict playing out behind her gaze, but I could also see something else, something deeper, more primal. Her lips parted slightly, and without thinking, without letting myself reconsider, I leaned in and kissed her. The moment our lips touched, it was like everything else fell away. The guilt, the fear, the awareness of what we were doing, all of it vanished in an instant, leaving only the heat of her mouth against mine. Her hands slid up to my shoulders, pulling me closer as she kissed me back, her movements growing more urgent, more desperate. I wrapped my arms around her, my hands sliding up her back as I pulled her against me. The kiss deepened, and any remaining doubts I had were drowned out by the overwhelming need that had been building between us for weeks. Her fingers tangled in my hair, her body pressed so close to mine that I could feel the rapid beat of her heart. We stumbled backward, her lips never leaving mine, until we found ourselves against the wall. I felt the cool surface press against my back, but I barely registered it. All I could focus on was her, the softness of her skin, the warmth of her breath, the way her body fit perfectly against mine. Her hands slipped under my shirt, her fingers tracing the lines of my chest, and I couldn't help the low groan that escaped my throat. Every touch, every kiss felt like a release, like we had been holding back for so long, and now there was no turning back. "I shouldn't," she murmured against my lips, but she didn't stop. Her hands moved up to my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. I didn't know how to respond. I knew she was right. We both knew this was wrong, but it didn't matter anymore. We had already crossed the line, and now there was no going back. The kiss became deeper, more frantic, as if we were both trying to make up for the time we had spent denying what we wanted. My hands slid down her back, feeling the softness of her skin under my fingertips, and I couldn't get enough. Her breath came in short gasps, her body pressing against mine as if she was as desperate for this as I was. I pulled her even closer, my fingers tracing the curve of her waist as we kissed again, harder this time, more urgent. The tension between us, the weeks of stolen glances and lingering touches, had finally reached its breaking point, and there was no stopping it now. She broke the kiss for a moment, her forehead resting against mine as she caught her breath. Her eyes were half-lidded, her lips swollen from our kiss. And in that moment, she looked so vulnerable, so beautiful, that it made my chest tighten. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling, but she didn't pull away. She stayed pressed against me, her breath warm against my skin. "I know," I said, my voice rough with emotion, but neither of us moved. Instead, her hands slid up to my neck, her fingers threading through my hair as she pulled me back in for another kiss. This one was slower, more deliberate, but just as intense. Her lips moved against mine with a softness that made my heart ache, and I could feel the weight of what we were doing settle over us, even as we ignored it. Her hands moved down my chest, and I could feel the tremble in her fingers as she traced the lines of my muscles. She paused for a moment, her lips parting as if she was going to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she kissed me again, her hands gripping the fabric of my shirt as if she was afraid to let go. I pressed her against the wall, my body moving instinctively closer to hers. I could feel her breath hitch as my hands moved to her hips, pulling her closer still. The heat between us was overwhelming, consuming, and I knew we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. But I didn't care. Not anymore. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the world outside had shrunk to just the two of us. Every sound, every breath, every touch was magnified, and I could feel the pull between us growing stronger with each passing second. There was a desperation in the way we kissed, like we were both trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, something we knew we shouldn't have but couldn't resist. "Emma?" I whispered against her lips, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I couldn't say. "This..." But before I could finish, she kissed me again, harder this time, her hands gripping my shoulders as if she was afraid that if she let go, we'd lose everything. The kiss silenced any remaining doubts, and I gave in, pulling her even closer, feeling the heat of her body pressed against mine. We stumbled toward the door, our hands fumbling as we moved, desperate to stay connected. I could hear the sound of our breath, heavy and uneven, as we pushed through the doorway and into the hallway. The world outside seemed distant, unimportant as we made our way to the bathroom. The door clicked shut behind us, and the sound seemed to echo in the small space, amplifying the tension between us. The bathroom was dimly lit, the soft light casting long shadows on the walls, and in that moment, everything felt surreal, like a dream I wasn't sure I wanted to wake up from. Emma turned to face me, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of emotions: fear, desire, guilt. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling as they reached for my hand, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. We both knew what we were doing was wrong, but the pull between us was undeniable. "I shouldn't have asked you to come in here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But she didn't let go of my hand. I shook my head, stepping closer. "It's okay," I said, though the words felt hollow. Nothing about this was okay, but I couldn't stop. Her breath hitched as I moved closer, my hand brushing against her arm, and I could feel the shiver that ran through her. The tension in the air was palpable, and every movement, every touch, felt charged with an intensity that left me dizzy. "I can't stop thinking about you," she confessed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know I shouldn't, but—" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest as her words sank in. This was it. The moment we both knew was coming, but had been avoiding for so long. "I've been thinking about you too," I admitted softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked up at me then, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and I could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid pressing down on us. And then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was soft, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that made my heart race. I closed my eyes, leaning into her touch, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't either," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "But I can't stop this." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her body pressing against mine, her hand still resting gently on my cheek. I could feel the tremble in her fingers, the rapid beat of her heart, and I knew, in that moment, that there was no turning back. She kissed me again, softly at first, but the kiss quickly deepened, becoming more intense, more desperate. My hands slid up her back, pulling her closer, and I could feel the heat of her body through the thin fabric of her clothes. We stumbled toward the sink, our bodies tangled together as we kissed, our movements becoming more frantic, more urgent. The cool surface of the sink pressed against my back, but I barely registered it. All I could focus on was her, the softness of her lips, the warmth of her breath, the way her body fit so perfectly against mine. For a long time, we stayed like that, lost in the moment. The tension that had been building between us finally reaching its breaking point. Her hands moved to my chest, her fingers tracing the lines of my muscles, and I could feel the shiver that ran through her as I kissed her harder, more desperately. But then, just as quickly as it had started, she pulled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "We can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't do this." I nodded, though my heart ached with the thought of stopping. "I know." But neither of us moved. We stood there, our bodies still pressed together, the weight of what we had just done hanging over us like a heavy cloud. The guilt, the confusion, the desire. It was all there, swirling around us. And I didn't know how to make sense of it. "I don't know what to do," she admitted softly, her voice filled with emotion. I didn't either. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say. And in that moment, I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I reached up, wiping away her tears with my thumb. "Don't be." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't enough. The damage had already been done, and there was no going back. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now we would have to live with the consequences. Emma stepped back, her body trembling as she pulled away from me, her hands still lingering on my arms as if she wasn't quite ready to let go. I wanted to reach out, to pull her back, but I knew that would only make things worse. "We need to forget this," she said, her voice barely audible. But we both knew that was impossible. The silence that followed her words was deafening. We both stood there, the gravity of what we'd just done settling over us like a suffocating weight. I could feel the air thickening between us, the lingering warmth of her body still etched into my skin. And yet the reality of what had happened hit me like a wave. Emma's eyes were wide, her lips still swollen from our kiss, and her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the sink, gripping it so hard her knuckles turned white. I wanted to say something, anything, that could make this right, but no words came. There was nothing that could fix this now. "I shouldn't have," she began, but her voice broke and she looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. "This was a mistake. We can't—" Her words trailed off, and I could see the turmoil etched on her face. She was battling with herself, with her feelings, and the realization of what we had just done. I felt the same war raging inside me, the desire, the guilt, the unbearable pull toward her that I couldn't shake. "I know," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "It was a mistake." But even as I said the words, they felt empty. They felt wrong. Because deep down, I knew that it wasn't a mistake. It was something we had both wanted, something that had been building for weeks, maybe longer. And now that it had happened, pretending it wasn't real, that it wasn't what we both wanted, felt like another lie. Emma let out a shaky breath, her fingers loosening their grip on the sink. She turned toward me slowly, her eyes red from holding back tears. There was so much pain in her expression, pain that mirrored my own. And it broke something inside me. "I don't know what to do," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. I stepped toward her, my hands hesitating at my sides. I wanted to comfort her, to reach out and hold her, but I didn't know if that would help or make things worse. I stood there, torn between wanting to pull her back into my arms and knowing that we had to stop, that we couldn't let this go any further. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "Somehow." She shook her head, her lips trembling as more tears spilled over. "But how? How can we come back from this?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, because I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how we were supposed to go back to the way things were before this. I didn't know how to move forward without destroying everything. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed, the betrayal I had committed. Claire, my wife, didn't deserve this. She trusted me. She trusted her sister. And here we were, standing in the aftermath of something that could tear everything apart. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know." Emma looked down, her shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. "I love her," she said, her voice breaking. "I love Claire. I never wanted to hurt her." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the same wave of guilt crash over me. I loved Claire too. I had never wanted to betray her, to destroy the life we had built together. But now, standing here with Emma, I realized that no matter what we did, we had already crossed the line. "I never wanted to hurt her either," I said softly. We both stood there, drowning in the weight of our guilt, our desire, and the impossible situation we had found ourselves in. The future felt uncertain, like we were standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink of something we couldn't come back from. "I think I should go," Emma whispered, her voice shaking as she wiped her eyes. I need some space." I nodded, though the thought of her leaving left a hollow ache in my chest. "Maybe that's for the best." She turned toward the door, her hand lingering on the handle for a moment. I could see the hesitation in her movements, like she wasn't sure if she could actually go through with it. And for a brief second, I thought she might turn back, that she might stay. But then she opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the hallway without another word. The bathroom felt colder, emptier, the silence pressing in around me as I stood there alone. I could still feel the heat of her body, the weight of her presence. But now it was all gone, leaving me with nothing but the crushing guilt of what had happened. I ran a hand through my hair, letting out a shaky breath as I tried to process everything. The memory of her kiss, the softness of her touch, played over and over in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just destroyed everything. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my head, but it didn't help. Nothing could erase what had happened. When I finally left the bathroom, the house was eerily quiet. Emma's door was closed, and I could hear the faint sound of her crying from the other side. My heart twisted in my chest, but I knew I couldn't go to her. Not now. Maybe not ever. I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the full weight of the situation crashing down on me. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead full of questions that I didn't have answers to. Would we tell Claire? Could we pretend like this had never happened? Would Emma and I be able to stay in the same house without falling back into the same trap? The questions swirled around me, each one more suffocating than the last, and I didn't know what to do. I closed my eyes, the memory of Emma's touch still lingering on my skin, and I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, things between us were strained. Emma stayed in her room most of the time, and when we did cross paths, the tension between us was palpable. We didn't speak about what had happened, but the memory of that night hung over us like a dark cloud, always there, always waiting to be acknowledged. Claire noticed the change, of course. She asked me if everything was okay, if something had happened between her and Emma, but I lied. I told her everything was fine, that Emma was just going through a rough patch, and she seemed to accept it. But the guilt gnawed at me every time she looked at me with those trusting eyes, every time she smiled at me like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Emma and I avoided each other as much as possible, but when we were in the same room, I could feel the tension building again. The stolen glances, the way her hand would brush against mine when we passed each other. It was all still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to explode again. And I knew that no matter how much we tried to deny it, no matter how much we told ourselves it had been a mistake, the connection between us wasn't going away. It was real, it was dangerous, and it was far from over.